Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural event of what we decided to call History Talks. The idea behind this, our last departmental meeting, upon the suggestion of Varak, is to get this series going. We're not inventing anything new, but the idea is to get used to the idea of hosting scholars, also having students who are working on certain research projects, talk about the challenges, the resources, and to have a kind of intellectual debate over this. Originally, and we will go back to this after Ramadan, this is supposed to be a light lunch, but given Ramadan, we will do this right after Eid, where we will have this upon the availability of topics as well as researchers. We are lucky enough to have one of our own visiting Beirut, Tylor Brand, who has a very interesting book which he authored while doing his PhD here. First of all, welcome back home, Tyler.
Thank you for
And
having
thank
me.
you for being our first speaker in this series of meetings. Other than this very interesting and a very good book on Lebanon, on a topic that I teach about, and I will start using it in class very soon. Tyler is one of the first graduates of our PhD program after it was reinstated. And he is a disciple of my own mentor, Abdurrahim Abu Hussein, where this book was written under his guidance, in addition to the fact that Tyler is also one of the co-editors of the book In the Steps of the Sultan, which will be also released very soon on the 16th of May.
Yeah, it's already out and
It's
can be
out,
purchased
which
for
you
the AUB
can
Press.
get through the AUB Press, but we will have the launch on the 16th of May. With this, I would like to welcome you back. Ahla wa sahla feek, and thank you for this honor that you give us.
You've honored me by inviting me back. Thank Varak, Makram, Dr. Sadr, thank you so much for making this possible. It's good to see so many people who I've missed. It struck me that I've been gone for 10 years when I came back, and I keep talking to people, and it seems impossible. But here we are, and it's a very different sort of situation, and I'm excited to be a part of this. So I'm kind of excited about this because it's not a normal talk. This is not just about me talking about the book and talking about the research, but talking about the process that went into this. So I'm sure that most of you probably haven't read any of this yet so far. So just kind of give it a summation. It's not exactly, I guess, what one would expect about a book about famine. If you think about famine books, you think maybe like Amartya Sen, sort of economic histories and things like that. Or you think about a book about World War I, you might think about, political histories of the war, like sort of behind the scenes things. Sykes-Picot is not mentioned once in this book. Now those sorts of things, of course, are incredibly important, but a lot of them have already been covered. And the things that really had fascinated me as I was doing the research on this wound up not being the things that people had written about until that point. And this, I guess, to get into the ideas about doing research on topics like this wasn't the book that was supposed to be made in the first place. I thought this was going to be an environmental history. The Jafet Library is filled with amazing resources, climate history, like statistics that really haven't been used extensively to deal with social issues and environmental history of Lebanon. But the more I started getting into it, and the more I started doing the research and finding things that begin to deviate, the more I started getting drawn into the more personal and individual aspects of the famine. So the book itself actually was very difficult to structure. When you write a book like this, you can structure it chronologically, but it's very difficult to talk about a complex crisis and organize it if it's chronological. If we think about even like contemporary situations that you all have been through, I'd say even going back to like say 2019, like if you were to write out the history of that event, how would you do it? To draw a timeline out would become very complicated because suddenly you have all these things coming in from different angles that have to be contextualized and have to be explained. And in a situation like the famine, which was essentially the same, 1914 to 1918, 4 years is a long time to not just, I guess, have a sort of kind of historical event, but to have an experience that is really defined by this shifting crisis that changes by season, changes by year, gets worse at certain situations. And because of the horrors that it produces, it changes people and how they interpret everything around them and how they interpret the people around them. So I stopped focusing on the environment. And there's a little bit in there. I mean, there's locusts on the cover. which strangely enough actually are an environmental effect. So as a result of the El Nino that was apparently actually quite strong, you had a shift in ocean currents that caused lots of rain in Sudan. So the rains in Sudan caused locusts to begin swarming, work their way up the Hejaz through Egypt, and eventually to hit Lebanon in 1950. So the interesting thing I think about doing a book like this really was the fact that I had to kind of split it apart into different sort of themes. To contextualize things, just talk about what happened and why, but then also to get to sort of like personal things. Now, how did people live during this time period? Now, how many people died? How did they die? What did it mean to walk down the street and see bodies lying on either side of you, day by day? What do you do if you're a municipal leader and there are so many dead bodies that suddenly the pauper burial fund that was given to you at the beginning of the year has been exhausted within a month? Like, there are many different sorts of problems that you don't really think about when you're thinking about a crisis like famine. You think about people starving, lack of food, and things like that. But it goes much deeper than that. It goes in a very personal sort of way, too. And I think the part of the book that was the most difficult for me to write, but in the end, I think that meant the most for me, was really to get at those individual experiences. I think the most important aspects, and I think that maybe for Varak and his classes, is the fact that part of the book is about how we narrate our experiences of crises like this, because it wasn't just about the famine happening, but how do you tell about it later on, and how do you think about it in the present? And I think that we look at historical sources and we think about them almost as being omniscient. You read them, and many sources seem very confident about what they're finding, especially because many of the sources that were written about the famine were written here. George Makdisi wrote his retrospective about this, and he was a professor. Edward Nickley's diary is one of the most detailed accounts of a sort of kind of day-to-day, kind of like almost like interpretation of his experiences. And of course, produced on campus, actually very close to here. And the more that you get into this, the more you see how these things impacted people in their daily lives, and even how it shifted people's attitudes in ways they didn't understand. Reading people writing an account, say in 1915, you often see the sort of sympathies that people have at the start of a crisis. You see people suffering in the streets, and you want to help them. And then you read the same person writing something in 1918, and it's like they're a different person. The words they use are different. The sort of framing of the suffering is different. And I think it's an important thing to kind of conceive of an event like that, and conceive of a crisis like that as a very complex sort of thing. And even if you're not writing about crises events, some of these sort of thoughts might be an important sort of thing. Like, what does the passage of time do to your subjects? Are they the same person? How are their attitudes shifting over time as a result of what's happening around them? So interpretations, I think, are a really important thing. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. But that's kind of, I guess, a basic introduction to, I think, what we're trying to do here. So if you want, we can then move on, and you can ask me some questions about this, and we can open it up to the crowd.
Yeah, format we have brief discussion. Open it to the floor for questions or comments for anyone who has read the book. First of all, I do want to congratulate you for this really fascinating book. I don't want to say I enjoyed it because it talks about the most horrendous aspects of war, but I think you really pulled it off on different levels because not only this is a challenge, a methodological challenge to basically talk about war, death, famine, but it's also talks about the famine in a special Lebanese context. And we know that the famine is part of the Lebanese national narrative, so you really pulled it off quite well. So one of the things I really appreciated in this work, and I just finished reading it, is that you basically moved from a very depersonalized account of the war and the famine, which at this point we all know why it happened, what happened, who were probably the most important actors in the famine, whether it was the Ottoman authorities or the British or the French blockade or the Entente blockade. But you go beyond that and basically have a much more personal or an emotional account of how people experience that. So I think one of the first questions that I really wanted to discuss with you is,
What are some of the challenges that you had as you dealt with some of the same sources that other people used, but you also looked or read between the lines to basically pull out some of those emotional aspects and how people, as you said, interpreted the famine in their daily life? So, what are the challenges as a researcher when you look at the sources, most of them stored as deficit?
Yeah. The big thing really is that you don't want to write in your own personal interpretations of what they're experiencing. But you also want to be cognizant about what they were trying to do. Some of them, like say Antun Yamin, wrote in part because he wanted to like identify, I guess, the suffering of the people and to, in his words, to blacken the pages of the lives of those who were responsible for the crisis. So when you're reading his work, you have to kind of keep these sorts of things in mind. And one thing that keeps coming up in the sources is that most of what people think they know about the crisis came secondhand. I mean, nobody can look down from a God's eye view and see everything that's going on at once. If you know something about what's happening, oftentimes it's because either you saw it with your own eyes, or somebody told you, or somebody told someone who someone told, and then you got to as well. So verifying many of these allegations in certain cases is very, very difficult. And so this is a big problem, I think, if you're trying to establish a narrative history. So what happened? And part of any historical text, of course, is trying to understand what happened and giving a sort of kind of relative value to what's going on. What happened? What is important about what happened? For me, though, it was very difficult because one of the things that kept striking me was that this was clearly something that was a very emotional sort of thing. Like reading, like say, the Diary of Edward Nickley or like say Judith Makdisi, they would speak about the emotional sort of traumas that they would have, seeing everything around them falling apart. And so when you're writing a history of an event like this, you're not just writing a history of, like, say, a timeline. Like, there's a trauma that's embedded in this that the people who are writing this are maybe not even cognizant about. And this is something that comes out really, actually, especially in Nickley, when he discusses, like, the sudden sensation that he had not realized that he had hardened himself off to the people around him. But when people came up to him on the streets, he would essentially avert his eyes, refuse to give them any sort of assistance, and even became very skeptical about the assistance that other people had been giving as well. And I mean, as a basic sort of event, that's not all that important. Okay, people became a little bit upset about the suffering around them. But what does that mean in a broader historical context? Because when you read it over and over and over and over again in the sources, this has a meaning. And for them, when they're writing this down, the fact that they chose to include that in the narrative too, I think was a very important sort of decision on their part. What are they conveying to us? Or in certain cases, what are they like unintentionally conveying that they didn't mean to write into the text? So it's very difficult sometimes trying to kind of, like as you said, read through the lines because, there's a fine line, I think, between interpretation and imposition. And as a historian, you never want to impose what you hope is in the source onto the source. But I felt as though I couldn't write this history without trying to capture that sort of the difficulties, emotional and even conceptual, that people had in describing things, even down to the aspect of language. Like, what words do you choose to describe certain events? Have certain sort of values conveyed in them. And so there's meaning embedded in that as well. And again, there's a lot of interpretation to be had in that. And if you interpret it wrong, then there's a consequence to that. So
I think honestly that in it's an account of human choices, rational or irrational sometimes, and
yeah,
it's a very lucid text that really. And I think one of the challenges as I was reading the text is to think about it as historians as how not to make moral judgments.
mm-hmm.
When you actually talk about cannibalism, prosecution, death, famine. What are some of the challenges as a historian not making those implicit judgments to do with those
Yeah. I mean, when it comes down to it, famine is a it's an economic situation. There are political aspects to this. There are social aspects of this as well. And in certain cases, in famines historically, there's been volition. In the current famine situation happening in Gaza right now, there's volition present there. In the case of the famine here, the general assumption was that the Ottomans had intended for this to happen. And you read through the sources, and clearly there is influence that the Ottomans had, either through corruption, either through kind of like mismanagement, individual soldiers, taking, or officials taking the law into their own hands, or trying to kind of benefit and profiteer from like their positions of power. It's something that is not necessarily, I guess, difficult to find evidence of. But at the same time, the general sort of assumptions that we have is that Jamal Pasha, the monster who has executed all these people in the squares of Damascus and Beirut, whose own personal attitudes about the situation often conveyed a sort of harshness, didn't intend, like many of the narratives had, to eradicate the population, as has been told in certain cases. But making value judgments is still kind of an important aspect of this, because like this does not say make him any less complicit in the tens of thousands of deaths that had taken place as well. So you have the value judgment aspects that link to politics. Then also you have the issue of say even the sort of personal situations, like if someone is say saying something that seems abhorrent, judging the poor, for instance. And especially towards the end of 1917, 1918, many of the people who are out there, especially doing relief work, have been exposed to the worst possible traumas you can imagine. So think about someone who's been emaciated to the extent that he no longer looks like a person. A father sitting there with their child, trying desperately to keep them alive. And it's a very emotional thing, and you can feel this in the writings. But also, people began to regard the situation to be a sort of kind of moral disaster. And there was a period of inhitat, something that comes up a number of times, that the morals of the population have been kind of ripped apart, pushing people into theft, to prostitution, things that would be normally unthinkable in the population that people had known before the war. And so their perception was, of course, shaded by that. And this also reflects in how they describe things. And so as a historian, you kind of don't want to judge them for what you feel maybe be them being a little bit too excessive in their descriptions. By withholding that judgment and trying to understand them empathetically. I think empathy is an important part of looking at sources like this. You can get a little bit more out of that than simply what they're saying. Why are they saying that, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, on that note, the community of sufferers, I think this would be this link with kind of support networks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what role does AUB play in this story? Famine.
Yeah. It was, yeah. And it's important because I think that's, again, getting to the idea of social collapse, of breakdown and sort of moral degradation. A lot of the assumptions were from many of these elite writers who only saw things essentially from the outside. I think that when you're having a crisis, there's many different layers. Not every single person in the country suffered, and not every single person who suffered equally or to the same extent. And the texture of this, I think, is a really important thing to kind of understand when you're talking about these sorts of things. Wait, I've lost my train of thought. Throw that one at me. The community suffers, so support networks. Got it. Sorry, very tired. So one thing that we tend to forget is that, support networks begin literally within the family. It starts in the beginning and it extends out into the community. And one will support as much as they can while they can. And the problem with many of the things that we understand about relief work is that the people who wrote about them tend to be the ones who are conducting relief work. And many of these relief work analyses were being written at a time when they needed to pitch this to donors. So especially the Americans trying to get money in from Presbyterians and Near East Relief. And one of the big things they had to say was, during the war and in the aftermath of the war, we, the missionaries, were responsible for saving. And Margaret McGillivray Zimmerman, who was the secretary at the American Mission at the time, Mission Press, it actually said that the Americans, a small army of Americans, had saved the entire Syrian people from annihilation during the war, which is a minor exaggeration, to say the least. But when you're reading this too, it very much skews the idea about who is responsible for this. So at its heart, it was family, the people who know you, the people who love you. And you can read memoirs. Ibrahim Khalil Awad, his father was off in, I think, Brazil at the time when the war begins. And of course, getting shut off from coming back meant that they couldn't send money back to help his family because the Ottomans prevented incoming or outgoing transfers. Why did they do that? Because the Ottoman bank was controlled by the French and the British were calling in the debt, and it would have bankrupted the Ottomans. This meant, though, that 41% of the GDP of Mount Lebanon and a very large amount of the GDP of the coast, which was remittances at the time, couldn't get into the country. So people who depended upon that are suddenly cut off from this. And again, this is familial networks that supported people in normal times. So where did people do? Well, Ibrahim's mother went to her father's house and wound up staying there with family, and they took care of them. Many people wound up doing this, and up until the point where maybe the food ran out and things began to crumble, this was the basic level of support that people had had. So the second one actually was kind of broader community. For many people, you had, like, say, a soup kitchen set up, or the wealthier people might make loans. In many cases, these were very usurious and caused lots of suffering in the aftermath. But even loans themselves, at a time when people need them, to give them food or money to buy food, was technically part of this network. It's ethical and unethical, but kind of still fits within this. Beyond this, too, though, the Americans from the American Mission Press actually tried to take credit for actually a lot of these sort of donations that were being made. One of the things that they famously had done is they figured out a way to smuggle lots and lots of funds in, despite the fact you have this prohibition on sending money through the banking system, and were able to distribute it to people all throughout the coastal area in Mount Lebanon throughout the time of the war. If you can't do that through the banking system, how do you do it? Well, they figured out that there's subsidiaries of the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, in various locations throughout the Ottoman Empire. So what they would do is that Syrian families based in America would come, give money to the American Mission Press. They would write down on a roster, the names and the locations. And of course, you have the American Mission Press secretaries trying to interpret the Amir poorly sometimes. So many of them didn't find their way. Yeah, it's on the UNC Carolla Center site. Yeah. So all of this information then gets sent via telegram. And actually, Nest has a very large amount of these archives if someone wants to go and do research on this. And then they would essentially kind of move the funds onto the books of the Rockefellers here. So in Istanbul, they would send money to, for instance, the post office, the Tobacco Regie, or any number of Ottoman agencies, and the head of the press would walk down, collect the money, walk back, collect the roster, and then begin distributing, oftentimes, again, through local networks. Mukhtars, local kind of people who are associated with the university. And even though there were some cases where there was some skimming off the top, for the most part, people got the money that was coming to them. And while the American missionary community had kind of claimed that for theirs, it was actually the money of the family members. This was Syrians helping other Syrians. Again, kind of collectivity and family doing what they could when normal methods were cut off. You move up another level, and you have, of course, the state, which was not openly giving at this time. The Ottomans didn't want the Americans to, or foreigners, kind of take away the sort of prestige that one gets from aid, because it's a very political thing. If you succeed in helping a population, this makes you very popular. If somebody else is succeeding when you should be succeeding, then this makes you look bad. So, for instance, when Azmi Bey came in to be the Wali of Beirut in 1915, the first thing he did was to cut off any sort of distribution of aid from other non-Ottoman agents outside of, actually within the Wali of Beirut. So the Red Cross, which had been doing lots of work until that point, wound up not able to work in the city. So they were able to move into Mutsarafiyah in Mount Lebanon because Ali Munaf Bey was willing to do this if they worked with the Red Crescent. Again, so you're not overshadowing the Ottomans, you're just kind of like joining up with them. And it did give them lots of connections to other aspects of relief work that was being conducted at the time. So it did benefit both the American efforts and the Red Crescent efforts. So this was able to continue in part because the Americans were able to essentially give kind of advances on what they expected to be sent and take out local loans in the meantime. So this was done mainly through soup kitchens and networks of, like, say, workshops, and generally in places that had American mission schools prior to this. So up in the Gharb, up in like the Metan for the most part. And so they had set up places, and mainly women and children could come and take advantage of this. Jamal Pasha had said if men wanted to get food, they could get it in the army. So they were not permitted to give it to men. But some of the shelters, like the big one in Brahmana, which was run by Alfred Dre, this served several thousand people at any given time. And local men were permitted to go and, like, say, for instance, work as, like, say, like making charcoal and things like this. So they could receive a salary, but they couldn't receive direct assistance. At the very top, finally, the Ottomans actually did have some role in this as well as, like, say, institutions like, say, the church, charitable foundations, and things like that. The Maronite Patriarchate was given money from both Jamal Pasha and the Ottoman state, but then also distributed as much charity as they could, as well as the Greek Orthodox charities, Muslim charities, and things like that. But the problem is, if you depend upon external donations, by the time you get to 1917, this is run dry. So there are a lot of limitations that all of these organizations had. Like, you can assist, but if you give out all your money because people ask for it, then suddenly you have no money by the time 1918 comes, and this is a bad situation. For the Americans, the other approach was taken, which was that they would give out enough to keep people alive, but a very limited number of people. So several thousand rather than tens of thousands of people, but intending to keep it going to the end of the war. So there's a lot of choices with this. You have this sort of like the need to triage and understand not only who needs it most, but then also who should be getting it. This is another interesting aspect that actually was difficult for me to withhold my judgments on, because the judgments that were made about who was to receive the aid wasn't necessarily the people who were maybe the most needy. Maybe people who would meet certain moral criteria, because the people determining this would see the degeneration caused by this sort of social collapse as something that was tainting the people who were receiving the aid or potentially receiving the aid. And they didn't want someone who would engage in, like, say, prostitution or theft or begging, who wasn't considered to be worthy enough to receive this, and thus, to survive to the end of the war, to then make whatever new nation was to come out of this. One of them, I think it was Shearer, had actually said, we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where the unworthy have survived the worthy. It's a very chilling thing to read in early 1918, when literally thousands of people are starving to death in the mountains. So the community thing is interesting because there's so many different layers and there's so many different aspects of this. And so picking it apart was very difficult in a chapter that was 29 pages long, but you do your best.
Why these sufferers, especially with famine is 16, there is a oral discourse or narrative of famine. Why are these sufferers?
Yeah, I think
was that kind of national humiliation? Other elements involved in that?
Yeah, I think this comes out, the national humiliation aspect, for what it is, exists, I think, in a sort of aftermath. I think this is something that people looking back on the era, famine is not a nice thing to have as part of your national mythology. In Ireland, for instance, the famine is something that people kind of clung to because it was a result of direct oppression by the British, and there was an obvious bad guy, and there was an obvious effect, and it essentially scattered the Irish throughout the world. And to some extent, of course, this happened in Lebanon too. In the immediate aftermath, once the ports are open, you couldn't get a ship out of here because everyone was hopping on ships trying to get out, and then people were trying to get in to come and see if their family members were still alive at that point. So I think that when you talk about, though, the sort of moral judgments and even the sort of social judgments that you see, it was part of the sort of kind of involuntary response that people had to what famine is. Like, famine is, as I mentioned before, it's terrible. Like, you've seen images of famine, I'm sure, just online, and you see these human beings who have been withered away from someone who is like any of us, to this unrecognizable sort of like kind of collection of skin and bones. And the languages that people would use about them were horrifying in certain cases, like very bestial imagery describing them, especially going after food. You know, in the souks, people would go and like say, you know, snatch bones that the butchers had thrown out and gnaw on them, very sort of like almost cannibalistic sort of manner. You know, children would be said to go on their hands and knees and pick, you know, grains of barley out of animal dung, and you know, people would comment on the sights, the smells, you know, the fact that these people, of course, can't wash themselves. It kind of horrified them. It was a repugnant and a repulsive sort of thing. And one of the problems as well, of course, is the fact that this time it wasn't just about the suffering and the death and the people who were, you know, visibly emaciated. You're also talking about, you know, the consequences of famine that in many cases are the real killers. You know, in famine, most people don't die of starvation. Most people die of opportunistic disease. So in this area that meant malaria. In this area that often meant typhus, because you had two major typhus epidemics between 1915 and 1916, and then again in 1917. And you know, who are the people who are most likely to be associated with typhus? Well, people who can't sterilize or clean their clothing to kill the lice and kill the lice eggs. This meant the poor. This meant that the poor person who's reaching out, pulling on your cloak to try to get you to give him something, might inadvertently then pass a louse on to you and potentially send you to your grave. You know, typhus killed about 18% of everyone that it infected, you know, in the second wave, and probably killed, you know, slightly more in the first wave. Some estimates, you know, Bahchat and Tamimi's, you know, kind of Wilayat Beirut survey had mentioned a couple of cases in Sur where they found, you know, 300 people had been infected in the city and 100 people had died. So about 33% case fatality rate, which is horrifying. Like if you have the chance, and we all endured COVID, and sort of uncertainty with even kind of interacting with people on a basic level. Think about that magnified from 1.5% perhaps case fatality rate to 1 in 5 and 1 in 3. And if that then is focused on a specific group, the poor, you know, the suffering, the dirty, this creates additional sort of social divisions and social judgments that then kind of come out of that as well.
So, you referred to people suffering as Syrians, which is basically my main point. That why do you think that the Lebanese still do not realize that the fact why we have modern Lebanon or Greater Lebanon was the fact that the political elite got to a point that this is an unsustainable entity unless we come together. And the people who founded modern Lebanon, in a way, underscored the importance of the commercial aspect of living together and making a lot of money so we could prevent another famine. So basically, and I think you do mention Yazan Halawani's the famine tree right in front of the Jesuit University. So the idea that Lebanon is here because of the famine, because if we did not experience the famine, the elite of Mount Lebanon, as well as the Beirut, would not have ultimately come together to form modern Lebanon. Does this thing come up?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that was kind of a puzzle that we had to deal with when you talk about the memory of the famine. Because like I mentioned, like the famine is very much present within Lebanese historical memory, especially in areas where it struck the worst or people acknowledge it striking the worst. This is something that was actually somewhat disputed. If you read contemporary accounts, people say the suffering was worse in Beirut because so many people came down from the mountain to try to find work. So Beirut, Tripoli actually increased in population despite the fact that tens of thousands of people died in them during the war, just because people come to places where there's work and there's food. And in small villages up in the mountain, you don't have the economic sort of gravity to command food coming in, especially if there's checkpoints set up that make it very difficult for normal supply routes to then, you know, distribute food. So the fact that it was then essentially kind of incorporated into the sort of the justification for the creation of Greater Lebanon, you know, at the Paris Peace Conference by Patriarch Kouik, immediately pulled the famine from being a collective thing that literally everyone throughout the region along the coast, you know, in Jabal Amel, you know, Nabatieh has, you know, a number of different very detailed accounts. Sulaiman Zahar has a really excellent discussion of this in his book about the war. Mohsen Al-Amin talks about his experience as well. This is a collective thing that wasn't just in the mountain. It wasn't just a Christian thing. Of course, on the coast, you know, suffering was incredible. In Tripoli, suffering was incredible. But it suddenly became something that was very touchy. whose famine was it? And because the famine was used to justify something that a significant percentage of the population, half or over half perhaps, depending on census data, completely rejected as denying them their political identity, the famine ceased to be a collective thing. It began something that became warped and kind of more disputed. How many people died suddenly became a question. Everyone would say it was a terrible thing, but in the immediate aftermath of the famine, actually, Shakib Arslan, who was very closely affiliated with Jamal Pasha, of course, and later on, of course, came out and tried to say, like, no, I tried to get Jamal not to do these things, and
He actually did the opposite.
yeah,
He told them to support.
yeah. So in the aftermath of that, he shifted his perspective too. Initially, he said that there was a famine, it was mainly the Allies that were responsible for that. After that, later on, he makes a judgment that about 200,000 people died. It wasn't just a small thing. In fact, it was based upon the Ottoman census, half the population, or if you count for the migrants that were still recorded within the census, well over half the population would have perished from that. And the death tolls become a sort of matter of kind of political value. The assumption that people died in very large numbers supported the fact that this was a terrible event, and especially if you attach it then to the Ottomans, it was an event that that needed to be remedied by some sort of protection in the future, which was in their minds French. On the other side, of course, you have people who saw the French mandate as the denial of their political fortunes, and for them, denying the sort of validation then of the famine became a matter of practical politics. I think that once this happened, on top of the fact that many of the people who wound up, of course, taking over the country and being very politically prominent were the people who had the warehouses, who had the contracts with the Ottomans, who hoarded and drove up prices, who gave usurious loans, and resulted in thousands of people dying because of their own personal desire to profit. That also does not make a very good national narrative.
The pastor, Ahmad,
First of all, thank you for the presentation. You said that in the Irish famine there was an obvious bad guy. Who was the obvious bad guy here?
The Ottomans, the elites, depending on your perspective, the Allies. There's a lot of blame to go around, really. And I think that when we look at a famine like this, and even within the Irish situation, it wasn't just the British who were responsible. It wasn't just the Irish landlords. Within every sort of situation like this, you have a sort of kind of series of social developments that over the course of a crisis begin to kind of like shift, I guess, the sort of foundations of society. The reason why we're able to go out and, like, say, purchase things at a reasonable price is because, like, these supply chains are open, and there's competition, which allows, like, say, if someone has prices very high, nobody's going to go to their place and buy their things. So when suddenly you have a blockade that cuts off access to most of the grain that one would import, this disrupts things. When you have political situations and political decisions, like, say, to fix prices, this leads to black marketeering and prices begin to rise. And so as the crisis begins to shift and begins to respond to all these changes that are taking place, the people responsible for these changes begin, numbers and sort of groups begin to broaden as well. In the aftermath of the war, the people who were generally blamed for this would be the Ottomans, and many of the people actually wound up blaming the elites. The first few volumes or books that were published about the wartime period actually weren't necessarily solely focused on the Ottomans, but rather had a very strong class component. There's a sense that the elites who were supposed to be there to support them, I mean, the sort of system as it was set up, they're the intermediaries with the state. They need to protect us. They're in charge of the economy. And their failures to do so was a moral failure as well. So there definitely were bad guys. But it wound up, I think, being a little bit more complex in part because of the political aspects that came in the immediate aftermath too, especially with the Paris Peace Conference. That's a great question.
Let's go with Herman, and then can you ask back to back question?
Yeah. Yeah, let's do one at a time because I'm definitely going to forget it.
Okay.
I start
How
rambling.
this works, but great to see you after all these years, Tylor.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a methodological slash procedural question.
Excellent.
So this book project developed out of your dissertation,
Yes.
I suppose, right? So for those of us who are currently interested in developing PhD dissertations into first books,
Yes.
what is the process like? How different is, authoring this book? How different is the final product as far as you judge it to be as the author of both works? And what kinds of changes did you have to introduce? What additional research or critique of yourself did you have to initiate? All of those things.
Yeah. I would not recommend that people follow the route that I did for this. I ended this. So I finished my dissertation, and your father, approved it in 2014, and it came out in August of last year. It was a process, and granted, there are many things that went wrong in between there. But maybe actually, I can't really regret that, because what came out in 2014 was a very different thing, because I was a different person then. I had a bit of desperation to get it out. The Lebanese government decided that I should only have 5 years to finish my PhD, and they informed me of this in like September of my final year. They said, well, we're not going to give you a visa. You can still stay at AUB. You just can't be here. So I began to accelerate the process of writing it at that point, which, strangely enough, I think it kind of got me into the mode, and was kind of easy to kind of have things flow. But I think that the thing with me is just getting it out is that you had so much information, and I had to kind of restructure it entirely. I had chapters that were 70 pages long, which enraged my committee. And the editors, of course, were not going to tolerate that. And I think it also depends on who your editor is. So at Stanford Press, Kate Wall is very hands-on, and she was brilliant how she took kind of the project in hand and tried to understand it from what I was trying to do, but also like what it should be as a book. I think when you're trying to do it, you have to kind of understand what the reader's going to want, and in many cases, this involves, paring down, like, say, lit reviews that readers don't want to read, incorporating them into footnotes, incorporating the theory within the text rather than in specific sections, and figuring out the narrative flow. And I think this is a really big thing. And that was the difficult thing for me. I rewrote the book literally 3 times. So once with the dissertation, I submitted a full manuscript in 2021. And then Kate was like, great, this is like, okay. So why don't you like rewrite it so it doesn't suck? And so in 3 months, I basically went through and rewrote the entire thing in a way that was more readable. And so that what it is nowadays is actually very much a process of that last writing. So the problem is it's going to take a while, I think, to understand what your book needs to be based upon what you want it to be. And you're a fantastic writer who is like riveting to read. So I think you could do something that would have this sort of like very readable aspect when you do it. But I think the big thing really is, I think, to have a relationship with the editor and not just let them drop it. Because many of the people I know who have done this, the editors are like, oh, this is great, fine. And then it's published without, I think, the sort of, I mean, it's a shared experience. This wasn't just my book in the end. It was a lot of people's, going back to my time here and then all the way up to the present. So yeah, it's a process. But,
Yeah, I have a question about the geographical extent of the thing. So, was Lebanon specifically hit by this? I mean, in the book you mentioned, for instance, that grain is smuggled to Lebanon from the Haran.
Yeah.
So, and therefore I take the crisis did not hit the entire region. So what about Palestine, Damascus, Aleppo, and so on? And if not, why Lebanon?
Yeah, so there's a couple different reasons for this. One is simply because the political divisions between the different, the Wilayah, the Muqtadafiyya, influence the accessibility of grain and political decisions that are being made. For instance, Jamal Pasha didn't want there to be smuggling of grain into Mount Lebanon at the time. This is the justification that he put up for putting in the checkpoints around the mountain. So any of the sort of roads that would lead in that normally people would use to bring in grain, because people still relied almost entirely on mule and camel trains to get into the mountain to feed them. So if suddenly you had to have a specific Ottoman permission to do so and to to get that permission, you often had to bribe someone or know someone. It created bottlenecks in the supply and lack of supply, and the fact that in Mount Lebanon, the monetary value tended to be a little bit weaker. So you're paying more anyways for goods, and now it's a scarce good that's already very difficult to get in. So smuggling has to bring it in. So plus the fact that the population centers in the mountain were much smaller than the cities, so grain wouldn't naturally get up there unless there was someone who was trying to get in. There are a lot of reasons why it was a little bit difficult to get the food into there. So many people in Mount Lebanon too had people who had migrated abroad, and generally this would be the men in the years prior to the war. They would be working abroad, they would have money, send it back as remittances. So this means that when the war shuts off access to the mountain, remittances aren't coming, but also men who would earn significantly more than what women could earn at the time weren't there to work, if there was work. And in many cases, the silk industry was shut down, so there was no work in the primary industry in the mountain as well. So this created a lot of suffering that was very unique to Lebanon because Lebanon was so dependent upon the world outside. So in Beirut, you had a similar sort of situation because a significant amount of the commerce in the city depended upon trade coming in from Britain or trade going out to France, plus the sort of financial sort of relationship that they had with the French silk industry in Lyon. So cutting that off again cuts off a lot of the jobs. And you have lots of people coming down from the mountains, so it's a different type of suffering taking place. So in these sort of agricultural areas, you have lots of conscription. So you have suffering in these communities that in many cases was kind of related to the war. And I think that the war and the famine can't be disaggregated. You don't have the famine the way it was without the war. You may have had some suffering because of some environmental sort of issues at the time, but like the war was the sort of catalyzing factor. So in areas like, say, Baalbek, you had suffering despite the fact that it produces lots of grain. In Zahle, which is a major grain producing area, you had tremendous suffering in part because people coming down from Kesirwan needed to find some work or needed to find food. So it's kind of a very complex thing. You go a little bit farther out, though, and in Damascus, you have vast grain reserves. In part, the army has been kind of commandeering this for use on the front lines. You did have suffering in the cities. And Nicola Zayadi actually had in one of the AUB, which one of the festschrifts, a personal account of actually being in Damascus at the time when this was going on. And there's suffering. You have typhus spreading, and you have high prices, of course, across the entire region. Not just in the Ottoman Empire. There was famine in Iran, there was famine in Greece. And again, the war is a big factor in this. But some areas like, say, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Oran didn't have quite the same sort of suffering because you did have grain that was grown locally, and the political sort of ability to then distribute it was a little bit easier as well. In the aftermath of the war, the granaries in these areas wound up, they opened up the warehouses, and they actually had to throw away a lot of the wheat because people were hanging on to it, just in case the war was going to go on for longer. So there were high prices, and people definitely did suffer. In Palestine, you can read some of the diaries, like, say, the Diary of Islam Turjuman, Khalil Sakakini, and there were things like, say, high prices. Rents were incredibly high. But in terms of the amount of death and destruction, the epicenter really was Beirut and Mount Lebanon and sort of kind of fringes around that.
It's a question from a sociologist, an ignorant sociologist of history. Well, my last conversation with my daughter in grade 10 in ECS, she told me that the meta narrative of the school, I mean the teacher, etc., to blame almost exclusively the Ottoman. And it's very interesting that another discussion a few days ago in the class where my daughter drew parallel between Gaza and the Israeli blockade and here the blockade.
Yeah.
So and for her, no, the blockade is she changed her mind. So so this is really, it's a very interesting to think how the blockade is important. I mean, in the light of Gaza. My last point is, I mean, in the mountain you have you have land. I mean, you people can cultivate things. I mean, of course, it's difficult to cultivate grain quickly, but I imagine. I mean, I don't understand why you have this the famine, etc. In Gaza, for instance, they are doing so much soup of green soup from the
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and this is actually a really interesting sort of question. And a number of the people actually who were making policy at the time had suspected that the Lebanese should be able to feed themselves because it's so green and it's so nice up there, and like everyone's got little patches of garden. So of course, I mean, of course you can feed yourself. And Faraiha actually writes about this, and he would say that no, in the aftermath, people actually started like when famine hit, like they began like say planting potatoes and planting beans and things in their gardens, and of course people would go out and like say get herbs and bring them in and try to make food out of that. And so you'd expect that people could do somewhat something to keep themselves going. But the problem is, and I'm a gardener, so I'm well aware of this, is a I was actually looking for the video from yeah. Um, that people could plant things and it would produce, but it's very seasonal, and you need to be able to not just I guess eat lots and lots of potatoes and things like these that would keep, but many things of course you have to like preserve and then use for later.
That's one thing. I grew up in Beirut. So we were obsessed. So we never the problem suffers
Yeah.
now.
And it was interesting because historically speaking, this is a very common thing throughout the Mediterranean. Like there's a reason why Mount Lebanon didn't grow their own grain, and it was because grain doesn't give you a very large rate of return. So rather than growing your own grain, that is like it's kind of like it's possible on these terraces, but it's not very efficient. You know, growing like say mulberry trees and feeding silkworms or growing fruit was a cash crop, and if you sell these very high value goods for cash, you then have cash on hand in case there's a crisis, and that was actually a protective factor for many people across the region, going back literally for hundreds of years. This is something you see in like Spain, Italy, Anatolia. And so that was one of the reasons I think why you have this monoculture taking over, because it was actually a protective factor when it came to famine. Like you didn't have any really severe famines actually, throughout the 19th century, even though you did have some that would kill people, like say the 1870s and some of the other really kind of tragic sort of circumstances when you have these environmental situations. But there's a lot of with the war and the blockade, suddenly this protective factor becomes a liability. And people could only keep themselves going so long with the stuff that they could grow. Faraya kind of emphasized this. It was something that would kind of like soften the pangs of hunger, but it wasn't something that was really a solution. And so the fact that the Ottomans assumed that the Lebanese could grow their own food also meant that they felt as though restricting access into the, like say, the mountain would protect the ability of, like say, Beirut to then get food, because Beirut was at that time, of course, much larger and needed a lot more food to keep it going. I think one of the difficulties in dealing with a famine like this from the administrative standpoint of the Ottomans is that, one, they didn't really know what they were doing. Nobody had faced something like this before. And even nowadays, with full knowledge about how to deal with famines, or better than we were before, we still mess it up constantly. People still die in huge quantities. Mm. Mm-hmm.
They had access to
yeah.
Not everyone died.
Yeah.
So in the school collective memory, you don't hear about the famine because they still feel every day it's famine. They have weapons and their mentality. So not everyone suffers. Especially church, I don't think it's kept up. Maronite church here still takes the name.
It did, I think. So the issue is that the Maronite Church had so many people who needed help, and there was an obligation to give if somebody asked. And that meant that a lot of the money they had to give went very quickly. You hear, like, I think it was the Archbishop in Tripoli had sold the silver cross of the church and had given it. So Yusuf al-Hakim writes about this, and so people had like tried to do what they could, but if it's not enough. I mean, it can only stretch so far, and without essentially the alleviation of the conditions that caused the problem in the first place, it would keep going and keep getting worse.
Hi, Tyler. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I'll pick up from Sari's last question about ACS. I know that ACS was acquired during the famine from the inhabitants of Ain Raisi. Did you look into how Lower Campus was expanded during that time?
Yeah, and a lot of this actually takes place afterwards too. If you look in the archive, actually, the Edward Nickley collection goes into great detail about the politics and sort of like negotiations that are taking place between, like, say, the Misr family and others who had had access to this land as they tried to expand it out to then take areas to make the campus bigger and to create the ACS.
And this brings me to my next question. So you focus lots on protein from grains and calories from grains. What about herding and fisheries during that time, before and after?
Yeah. So the fisheries thing is very interesting because someone had actually asked me, well, the Mediterranean is right there. Like in the Irish, when they were suffering the famine, many of them would rely upon like things you get from the sea, like shellfish, snails, whelks, and things like this. And actually nowadays, I had asked my Irish friends, like, nobody eats seafood here except for fish and chips. Like, why don't you eat seafood? Like, it's wonderful, and the sea is right there. And they said, well, that was famine food. Like, that kept us alive. And we don't want to touch it anymore. So there's a big problem with getting the fish out of the sea, which was the fact that the Entente blockade was right there. And the Ottomans, fearing that people would be sending spies and information back and forth, forbade anyone from going and doing anything by the sea. So kids could go down and swim in, like, say, the swimming holes over here. But women going to, for instance, collect seawater and boil it off to make salt was forbidden. So the Ottoman soldiers would come and like drive them off and break their baskets and things because spies legitimately were actually using the coastline to send messages back and forth to the French in their base in Arbad Island. So fishing wasn't really too much of a thing. Leila Fawaz in her book actually talks about this one fisherman who kind of like defiantly is out there like continuing to fish despite any of these prohibitions and the difficulties. But it wasn't something that you could turn into something that keep you going. In Gaza, we have the similar situation, of course. Fishermen can't go out and fish because they get their boats shot at. So in the case of husbandry, this was actually something that kept many people alive. I've talked to a number of people whose like families actually had like a goat, and each child had a goat, and that goat kept them alive just through milk. So husbandry, with something like, say, chickens that have eggs, like goats, cows that can produce milk, this is something that is a kind of a renewable sort of resource when it comes to sustaining oneself. So many people, if they had animals like that, this was a major sort of factor that would help keep them alive, especially if it's something that you could sell, because then you're not just relying upon drinking milk, which is fine, but I mean, you need the caloric impact of, like, say, like carbohydrates and vegetables and things like that. And if you can't grow that in sufficient quantity, you got to buy it. So being able to, like, say, take milk down to the city, make lebanon, make cheese, this was a really important thing. And actually, one of the people I talked to in this, her family actually were landowners in the Gharb, and they actually found that if they brought, like, say, cheese and lebanon down to sell in Beirut, because you get better prices. An interesting thing too, why didn't they sell it in the mountain if people were starving? Well, people didn't have money in the mountain, so you take it to where you can make money, because you have to look after your own interests. You have to keep yourself alive. So they bring it down, and the Ottoman soldiers, because it was bringing food in and out of the mountain, would say, well, you don't have a permission for that, so we're going to confiscate it. So they wound up actually, instead of taking down cheese and lebanon, they would begin taking down milk. The soldiers couldn't keep the milk; it would just go bad, and they couldn't drink a bunch of milk. So they'd just take the milk down, and they would dress up like poor people, so the Ottoman soldiers wouldn't even bother with them. Take it down to Beirut, and then sell the milk, and then take the money from that and bring it back up, or buy food, bring it back into the mountains, and they kept them alive. So animals and land really are the two things that, if you had them, you were much better off than anyone else and could survive at a much better basis.
Last question. Three questions for
Yes.
You mentioned, for some reason, I don't know why, from the sources, I was under the impression that conscription of men for the war, strictly speaking, of the Ottomans wasn't so, didn't have such large numbers in Lebanon. But when you mentioned that actually the people working land were also that central crisis, just wondering how were from agriculture and to food.
If I'm remembering the numbers right, and I may not be, it was over 250,000 conscripted out of Greater Syria. I mean, the Ottoman Empire had about 2.8, 2.9 million people that conscripted by the end. But from here it was a little bit less, in part because the Ottomans didn't trust Arab fighters, and there's like certain kind of like racial hierarchies that they'd established, especially the Christians, and so they often just stuck them in labor battalions and back lines, which was still dangerous. You still die of typhus and malaria there, but.
I have two questions. The first question is, were there any noticeable shifts in demographic shifts that we saw in Lebanon? And second of all, were there any perceptions or any narratives that were subscribed to that changed during the course of your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the basic assumptions we have when we go into the research is you initially either trust or distrust the narratives that you're given. And for me, I tried to stay very skeptical. I wanted to see what the information turned up when I was actually looking at it. Over the course of the research, I began to feel less like the Ottomans were directly responsible, but they were indirectly responsible, or in certain cases directly responsible, but it was a complicated thing. The Allies, I feel, definitely had a lot of responsibility. The elites had a lot of responsibility. So the narratives, in many cases, had an element of truth to them. But it was kind of, you had to look at it as a whole situation rather than simply as, like, say, this person did it or this person was more responsible. Because without everyone contributing to it, you wouldn't have had the famine that looked like that. And I think that's the important thing. The dynamic process, and it's very flexible. Think about demographics, we don't really know exactly how many people were there. We have, of course, Ottoman censuses, but the people who actually write about this in Nabih about Lebanon, and it was published in 1918, is that they kind of suspected that a third of the population was not there, compared to what had been actually tested before the war. And in the aftermath, you have the French taking a census in 1921, and you can kind of cross-reference it, but you can't trust it because you don't know what is correct and what's accurate between the two different numbers. So it's tough. I mean, probably the greatest number of people who died were from Ketsemanian. Mount Lebanon had, in the northern region, more deaths probably on average than the southern region. But of course, there were still mass mortality in the Shuf, at least 3,000 orphans in the Shuf aftermath, both Druze and Christian. So it's something that is actually worth looking at. But it's also one thing that we can never really, truly get a good grasp on, unfortunately.
Thanks for the talk to begin with. I have a bit of a reductive question, although I think it might be a good way to end things. I don't know if you like it, but let me just say it, okay? If you were to ascribe a percentage for the factors that led to the famine, let's say the Ottomans, the Allied blockade, the silk industry, and all of the other factors you mentioned, like hoarders and so on, how would you divide it?
I think it's very difficult to do that. I think that if you look at it, again, as we're talking about this as a dynamic process, is there different things that essentially are catalysts at certain points, or they prevent the sort of correction of problems that are forming. So for instance, like say the Entente blockade is essentially a sort of hold function. So if you have, say, a lack of food in the region, or like say increase in prices that can be alleviated by a kind of a more free-flowing market, if the blockade is present, either the Entente one or the Ottoman restrictions on transport, this is not going to lift this problem, and it's going to kind of allow the situation to continue to kind of devolve and get worse and worse and worse. And so this is kind of a consistent sort of issue. You had things that were kind of like more immediate sort of like catalysts, things like say the locust invasion in 1915. This came and eradicated, and we can guess maybe 60% of the crops across greater Syria. And this has an immediate impact, not just on access to food. There was allegedly 2 years worth of grain in Damascus stored at the time, but it caused governments to start changing how they began responding to things. Like, This prevents you, like say, governments from sending food into different areas. People began hoarding because this meant a rise in prices. So even if you're not worried about getting access to food for yourself, if like maybe this commodity is suddenly going to become very valuable, you may be getting rich off of this in the future. So when we look at this, I think we should see this as, again, a sort of confluence of factors. Everything comes together to make it what it is. And I think that there's enough blame to go around. And I think the people who took part in that really do deserve their share of it. But again, as historians, I think that like focusing very much on blame kind of detracts from, I guess, what we should really be looking at. I think that there's a political dimension to that. And as historians, I kind of tried to focus on the sort of